Thanks very much for joining us. On today's webinar, we're going to be looking at women's nutrition through an empowerment lens. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by two of our IMMANA grantees, Amy Webb Gerard, who is an assistant professor at the Hubert Department of Global Health at the Rollins School of Public Health, Emory University. Amy teaches courses on global health, food policy and food security, and participatory engagement. Her teaching, research and areas of interest focus on social determinants of maternal and child nutrition and the development and evaluation of community-based participatory strategies to improve women's capacity to nourish themselves and their family. Amy is joined by Erin Lentz, who is an assistant professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Austin at Texas. Erin received her PhD in sociology and an MSc in applied economics. She has received a Fulbright fellowship to Bangladesh to research the secondary effects of food aid in local communities, and she has worked or consulted with CARE, the United Nations Food Programme, and numerous other international NGOs on markets, food security and food assistance programs. Erin and Amy will be facilitating today's discussion, but they are joined and there's been considerable input from their colleagues at their institutions as well, who will also be joining today. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Amy, who is going to begin, and I think they'll be talking for around about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A and discussion.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. As Joe has said, Erin and I will be presenting on our two, on our two grants that Erin and I have. My grant is on women's empowerment and livestock-focused agriculture, identifying and understanding pathways to impact, and it's a multi-institutional collaboration. Researchers in University listed here, the International Livestock Research Institute, the Georgia Institute of Technology, and Stanford Vulnerable Organization based in Ethiopia. The three institutions work across three sites in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. For that collaborator, Environment and Nutrition Index. Both of these are IMMANA grantees, and we're very excited to bring our current work together to talk about women's nutrition through an empowerment lens. The brief organization of the webinar today is going to begin with a brief discussion of the gaps when we talk about women's nutrition and the role that women's empowerment plays in facilitating improvement in women's nutrition. Then we'll move into some preliminary work based from the two grants. Two of the presentations will be coming from our work on women's empowerment in livestock systems and women's empowerment in nutrition. First, with a presentation from a doctoral student in sociology at Emory University, Stephanie Maidima, who will talk about domains of women's empowerment across contexts in East Africa and associations with maternal anemia, followed by an overview of the Women's Empowerment in Livestock Index that has been developed by the International Livestock Research Institute and currently being validated and tested in Tanzania. And that session will be presented by Alessandra Gallier, a gender scientist from ILRI. We'll then follow that work with the initial findings or initial work that has been done by Erin and her team on the Women's Empowerment Index and Nutrition and its development. We'll follow that up with questions and discussion. So just to kick us off, in terms of women's nutrition, we still have over a third of women of reproductive age who are anemic, which is telling of not only women's access to nutrition, but also their access to health services and their capacity to prevent infection and exposure to infectious diseases. Approximately 19 to 20% of pregnant women have iron deficiency anemia specifically, with the rates being highest in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. We still have higher prevalences of vitamin A deficiency and night blindness among pregnant women and women of reproductive age. And over 10% of women in Africa and Asia are considered thin or have very low BMI. Concurrently, though, over the past decade, we've seen large increases in overweight and obesity. And all of these things converge to have adverse impacts both on maternal mortality as well as morbidities during pregnancy and diminishments in women's nutrition during pregnancy and lactation, which has direct impacts on their infant's birth weight, infant mortality, and infant growth and development. And it's been noted that the limited progress we've seen meeting the Millennium Development Goals for both women's and children's health is likely related to the limited emphasis we have given on maternal nutrition. That first 500 days of that 1,000-day window when infants are entirely dependent on their mothers for nutrition. As we move into the post-2015 development agenda, we have ambitious targets to eradicate hunger and malnutrition in all of its forms, and a global nutrition target to reduce anemia in women by 50%. And it has been noted that without an emphasis on women's empowerment and women's social status, we will likely not realize these goals. We know that measures of women's empowerment from multiple studies in numerous contexts are associated with improved infant and child nutritional status, improved food security of children, improved complementary feeding practices, and improved breastfeeding practices. And recent research by the IHME, as well as groups independent of that from IFPRI, have shown significant improvements in malnutrition and child mortality related directly to women's education. However, much less attention has been given to the role of women's empowerment for their own nutrition and health outcomes, with the exception of a body of work around family planning. But before we move into this conversation about women's empowerment, I'd first like to ask Catherine to briefly describe what we mean by women's empowerment based on the conceptual framework that her team has developed.
Amy, thank you. And just to say, this has been a pleasure to work with the team here, and I think there's some very exciting results to be discussed. The framework that you see in front of you is elaborated actually from a framework originally by Naila Kabir, which was published in the late 1990s, but substantially elaborated to clarify the components of women's empowerment and the process by which it can improve women's nutrition as an important achievement for the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the three main concepts you see in this framework come from Naila Kabir's work. Enabling resources being the human, natural, financial, social, and physical resources that women accumulate, ideally, over their life course. By human resources, we mean things literacy, skill development, training, and schooling, which is one of the most common measures of human resources. Financial resources could be anything from productive assets, movable assets, earnings, income, etc., savings that women accrue as a result of enterprises. Social resources we primarily think of in terms of the relationships and networks that women build outside of the family. The family can be both constraining and an opportunity for women. So we're interested in positive peer networks, engagement in organizations that provide social capital, and those sorts of things. Physical resources would be the kinds of endogenous resources that women embody, and so would be reflected in things like their accumulated height and other physical capacities. Agency in our own work we have operationalized through three concepts: women's freedom of movement, which is relevant in settings such as South Asia primarily. The influence that women have in decisions, not just related to decisions in the family, but decisions related to the entire scope of actions that they would take in their own lives. Voice and viewpoints refer to attitudes about gender and the extent to which women feel they can express attitudes that may contradict the norm in their community. And then finally, achievements in this context would be reflected in precisely the kinds of indicators that Amy mentioned: women's own health and nutrition, and then more instrumentally, the health and nutrition of their children.
Thank you, Catherine, for that overview. And there have been some work in terms of how we go about empowering women and also how we go about improving nutrition. And an area that at least I am extremely interested in, and I think many of the participants based on the roster are also interested in, are these agricultural pathways to nutrition impact. Over time, we have seen the ways in which agriculture could potentially achieve improvements in nutrition. And I'd like to just briefly outline this pathway. You'll note on the screen currently the modified UNICEF conceptual framework for nutrition and health, speaking predominantly issues around caregiving and caregiving of both women and children and how that affects diet and feeding practices, water, sanitation, and hygiene practices, and health seeking, and these interacting to affect both intakes and illness, working together through the body's ability to utilize nutrients to improve maternal and child nutrition. It's also well known that maternal nutrition has a direct impact on caregiving, especially issues like anemia, which can reduce a woman's productivity, her energy, and potentially contribute to mental health complications that then impair her capacity to provide adequate care for her children. When we think about agriculture, we see agriculture as a primary contributor to these caregiving domains through multiple pathways. So if at a household level we increase production of crops that can be used for food, these crops can either be retained in the household and contribute to household food security and thereby influence diet and feeding of children. They may also be sold for income, and then the income can either be used on food expenditures or non-food expenditures. And then how those are used can contribute to increasing access to essential services such as wash, health, and again, food security at the household level. Production at the household level also influences market availability and access for a broader community food security system and influences food prices, which will affect household food access ultimately. This is a general theoretical framework that I'm sure many of you have seen. We've realized over time, however, that just this pathway, just focusing on household production in and of itself, is insufficient and does not provide us with the impacts on child nutrition and maternal nutrition that we would expect. Increasingly, we recognize that these strategies must be gender sensitive. The production components, the inputs, the extension services need to be targeted to women to include them in those processes for an outcome around women's empowerment so that women are actively engaged in decision making with regards to what happens with those products once produced, as well as issues around time and labor saving for women so that women that are engaged in these agricultural strategies do not do so at the expense of their own health, their own energy expenditure, or at the expense of time that is used for caring for their children. We've also realized recently, and there have been several reviews around this, that these systems not only need to be gender sensitive, but they must also be nutrition sensitive. The foods that are produced and focused on need to be high quality foods. Vitamin and mineral rich fruits and vegetables and animal source foods are critical, and inputs for those will go much farther in terms of improving diet and nutrition than a staple-based production process. There's also the need for nutrition education and counseling that are participatory and effective so that those foods are then either retained in the household for consumption by the mother and child, or if they are sold, that expenditures for food are for high quality foods as opposed to simply replacement with staple crops. And again, nutrition education and counseling has been an important component seen for these. And so together, both the nutrition sensitive and the gender sensitive components must sandwich, if you will, the agricultural strategies if we want to see maximal impacts on maternal and child nutrition. Because of the issues around women's empowerment and the potential role that agriculture can play, there has been some progress in measuring women's empowerment in agriculture with the development of the WEA, the Women's Empowerment in Agricultural Index, that was developed by IFPRI with support from USAID, among other donors. And it consists of two primary components, the 5 Dimensions of Empowerment Index, as well as a Gender Parity Index. And this tool has been validated in several contexts. but its focus is largely on crop-based agriculture, though a livestock module add-on is in development. But livestock-focused agriculture presents its own unique challenges in terms of gender relations, gender norms, as well as nutrition, because animal source foods produced by livestock programs are extremely high in bioavailable protein and micronutrients, especially iron, and can serve as a very important component for accelerating the capacity for nutrition-sensitive interventions like agriculture to improve maternal and child nutrition. So with those issues in mind, the work that our particular grant focuses on is around these livestock-focused agricultural strategies and how we can understand pathways to impact for maternal and child nutrition, looking specifically at women's empowerment. We're going about this in 3 ways. We're doing an overall analysis of DHS data from East Africa to identify relevant domains of empowerment for maternal and child nutrition. We're conducting qualitative research in 3 sites where we have ongoing livestock-focused value chain programs. In Ethiopia, where there is a poultry-based livestock value chain, Northern Kenya for a livestock-based value chain, and in Tanzania for a dairy value chain. And then within each of those 3 sites, there is also quantitative research ongoing that involve household surveys of women's empowerment, and we will be doing exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis on that data to identify the relevant domains for women's empowerment in these particular projects, using that information and the qualitative research to refine the empowerment indices and then examine associations between empowerment and indicators of maternal and child nutrition and associations between program participation and change in domains of women's empowerment. One of the unique aspects of these 3 sites, by and large, is the data is longitudinal in nature, and so we can actually see change over time at the level of the individual woman or household. Excuse me. So with that in mind, I would now like to shift over to our individual presentations. Our first presentation will be from Stephanie Maidema, a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology here at Emory, who will be presenting on the preliminary DHS analysis that we've been doing across countries.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And it's wonderful to be here with you all and to have the chance and the opportunity to hear about everybody's project here in the IMMANA overall project. So I'll be speaking today specifically, as Amy said, about the DHS analysis that we're conducting here and looking particularly at the differential item functioning of women's empowerment measures and then associations with maternal anemia in East Africa. So just to touch on this briefly, we got a great conceptual overview from Catherine and Amy, but just touch on this briefly. There are questions still in the women's empowerment field about how we meaningfully measure this very complex and convoluted concept, and particularly how we measure this in cross-cultural settings. So does women's empowerment actually mean the same thing and take on the same types of domains in very different cultural settings? So that's part of what we'll be looking at today as we look at the different ways in which the DHS measures women's empowerment in different countries across East Africa. There's also little consensus on how to consistently measure women's empowerment in the context of maternal and child health and agriculture livelihood development, particularly across low and middle income countries, which of course much of the IMMANA work is contributing specifically to building the literature on this and to look at how we more effectively do measure empowerment in the context of agriculture. Catherine already gave a really nice summary of Naila Kabir's framework and also how these 3 components of resources, agency, and achievement create an empowerment framework or create a framework in which we can understand different components of women's empowerment. And I just want to touch on this for those of you who may or may not be as familiar with the DHS data set, that this framework did directly feed into the development of questions on women's empowerment which were integrated into the demographic health surveys from 2000 onwards. And so those predominantly, obviously, the questions around education and income were already set standard questions in the standard DHS surveys. But since 2000, the DHS has included questions on women's attitudes toward violence against women, so justification of wife beating under various circumstances, and also different kinds of household decision making. And so what we are looking to do in this analysis over here with the DHS survey in East Africa is to determine whether the factor structures of women's empowerment operate in similar ways across countries. And what I mean is we want to measure how well these questions around women's empowerment as operationalized through the DHS are actually similar across different settings. Are they actually capturing similar domains of women's empowerment? And then our second study objective, which we won't be focusing on as much today, but is part of the overall analysis procedure, is to determine whether there are differences when we constrain the analysis by indicators, measurement indicators that are actually asked in each country, or whether or not we allow the factor structures to unfold based on culturally specific questions that are asked pertaining to women's empowerment. So the data that we'll be using is from Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. So as you can see, some overlaps with the countries that the project's actually doing work and interventions on in East Africa. These are the East African geopolitical and trade bloc countries. We're using DHS standard surveys in each country, and so the most recent ones range from 2008 to 2011. And the analysis is restricted to currently married women only. That's predominantly because much of the theoretical frameworks and much of the literature on women's empowerment does focus on levels of empowerment among women who are already in established relationships. So we are restricting the analysis here. The empowerment domains that we're actually theorizing that we'll probably see coming out of the factor structure are the two ones that you'll see are familiar. They're the ones that I mentioned earlier in terms of the questions added to the DHS. A factor around decision making in the household and a factor related to the justification of wife beating. But we're also hypothesizing that we'll also see a factor related to some of the assets brought to marriage. So linking back to what Catherine mentioned about the different kinds of resources that women actually are able to accrue in their life, the social, the financial, the human resources. And so we're expecting to see a factor related to that. So the statistical techniques that we use, we split the sample in each country. So we ran these analyses in each country, splitting the sample to run first an exploratory factor analysis in which we tested 1 to 6 factor models. So again, we hypothesized a 3-factor model, but we wanted to test to see whether other factor models may actually be better fitting. Then we selected the best fitting model based on a number of fit statistics, the TLI, CFI, and RMSEA, and based on a number of decision criteria, we finalized the best fitting model. So for example, non-loading items less than 0.3 were dropped, and items that cross-loaded across factors at greater than 0.3 were dropped. Once we had the best fitting model, we used the other half of the split sample to run confirmatory factor analysis to confirm that this factor structure was indeed best fitting, and that's what we'll be presenting here today. We are running multivariable regression analyses to look at the factor scores as regressed onto maternal anemia for each empowerment domain. We have some preliminary findings pertaining to that we'll also present today. So these are the results from the confirmatory factor analysis, and just to, there's a lot here, so just to walk you through what you're seeing. For each country, you'll see the countries listed across the top: Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. For each country, you'll see that the best fitting model was in fact a 3-factor model, and we're generally seeing that factor 1 is related to human and social assets, factor 2 is related to attitudes around violence against women, and factor 3 is related to influence and decision making. So again, confirming what we had originally hypothesized. You will note that the factors, while they follow these topical areas, do not necessarily fall out in terms of 1, 2, 3 across countries. For example, in Rwanda, factor 1 is attitudes around violence against women. But regardless, the factor structures themselves do follow these 3 domains. So the range of scores for factor 1 the range of factor loadings for factor 1 range from 1.174 to 3.721. Just to note, these are the unstandardized estimates. The range for factor 2, factor loadings are ranging from 0.737 to 0.957, and for factor 3 ranging from 0.541 to 0.915, with the exception of the 0.217 for spousal earning difference that's loading onto factor 3 there in Uganda. That was retained because it came out as greater than 0.3 in the EFA. So again, generally we're seeing that these factor loadings are fairly consistently and systematically loading in similar ways across countries. So we did run initial analysis of the associations between maternal anemia, and this was a dichotomous variable, any or no anemia, and the different domains of women's empowerment using the generated factor scores for each of the 3 factors. These are the results just from Ethiopia as an example for you all. So what we're seeing is that for human and social assets, we see no significant association between maternal anemia. However, for attitudes around violence against women and influencing and decision making, those 2 factors are significantly associated, and what we're seeing is the greater the influence in decision making, the less likely a woman will be to have maternal anemia. Conversely, the more likely a woman is to justify attitudes around wife beating, the more likely she is to have anemia. So again, these are associated in the expected direction. And so just to wrap up, a little bit of what we're seeing. So again, across all 3 countries, the 3-factor model of women empowerment does show the best fit, and that is consistent across all of the countries. We see strong factor variable associations across all latent constructs. The justification for wife-beating factors were the strongest factors in terms of the factor loadings representing, that the items were representing more strongly representing a unified domain or concept, yeah. And we are seeing also that there are similar patterns in item loading onto factors across the country. So although a few of the items didn't load onto specific factor domains in some countries, but loaded into other countries, generally speaking, we are seeing the same pattern across human and social assets, household decision-making, and attitudes toward wife-beating in terms of the items that are loading onto these latent domains. And the results from the initial regression tests with maternal anemia do suggest that these latent constructs may actually need to be considered independently in terms of their effect on maternal and child nutrition. That said, there are a few things that we still have to do, of course, and so just to skip to the second point here, we are planning to break down the predictors of anemia to actually test direct effects of human and social assets on maternal anemia, because we do know from the literature that women's education, for example, is likely to be highly associated, and so we want to explore that further and unpack some of those results a little bit further statistically. What we'll also do is run a multi-country comparison test of factor invariance, so actually quantitatively assess whether the factor structure is consistent across contexts. So what we saw here today was kind of a qualitative assessment that generally speaking, yes, this looks like this is pretty much the same across contexts, but we will actually test that statistically to provide quantitative assessment of whether or not that is actually true. And then finally, we will also be planning to test these women empowerment latent structures, not only for predicting maternal anemia, but then also for predicting BMI across these countries.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephanie. We'd now like to move into Dr. Alessandra Gallier's presentation on the Women's Empowerment in Livestock Index, which is a manuscript they are currently working on there at ILRI. Alessandra?
Hello everybody, this is Alessandra Gallier. Thank you so much, Amy, for introducing. I work as a gender scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi. Thank you so much for inviting to give this presentation. The presentation is about the Women's Empowerment in Livestock Index, which I will call WELI, and it's a methodological overview of the WELI. It is based on a manuscript we are currently working on. Next slide, please. Thanks. So my colleagues have already discussed about empowerment, so I will just give a brief introduction. Empowerment is by now very common in development discourse and is seen often as a means to enhance both gender equity and also reduce hunger, mostly through both institutional and technological improvements. But why focusing on the empowerment of women farmers? Women farmers are involved in food production and provision. At the same time, they have a disadvantaged access to resources and opportunities. In terms then of the empowerment of women livestock keepers, well, they have the same situation of the women farmers overall, that is, they produce and provide food. They have a disadvantaged access to resources, and in addition, they're also the majority of the poor livestock keepers. Livestock also offers key opportunities to both enhance the access of women and control to assets, much more, for example, than women can control much more livestock than, for example, buildings or land. And at the same time, as Amy mentioned before, livestock can provide key opportunities to enhance household nutrition through animal source foods. We therefore decided to develop this tool, the WELI, because we wanted to measure quantitatively the empowerment of the women livestock keepers involved in a project in Tanzania. And we think this is instrumental to progress on enhancing empowerment, because by understanding if the project is actually effective in enhancing empowerment or not, we can also progress on and develop better interventions, but also increase accountability. Once we have a quantifiable score associated to empowerment, we can actually increase the accountability of projects. And WELI is a tool that is a women's empowerment in livestock index, so it's a tool that is specific to livestock. And we developed this tool because we really thought it is a key importance that we assess empowerment for livestock, for women livestock keepers, and for the nutrition component. The tool, the WELI, was developed by ILBE in collaboration with Emory University in 2015. It's based on the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index that was introduced by Amy before, and we adapted it based on our previous work in Tanzania and knowledge of the local context on a formative study that was undertaken by Emory University, and we also undertook substantial adjustments to include livestock activities, because as I said, this was really the focus of the tool, in collaboration with livestock experts. The WELI was developed in conjunction with a nutrition survey developed by Emory and ILBE together, because we wanted to assess also how women's empowerment affects the nutrition of the women themselves and of their children. The tool was implemented in Tanzania in the project in the sites of the project More Milk It in 2015 with 373 women. Yes, thank you so much. So the main sections of the WELI are the following. So the WELI starts by asking the women respondents to specify which species is most valued by women themselves for their own livelihoods, and then which species are most valued for the household livelihood. And this is very important because we know that the involvement, the access to, and the control that women have to livestock are very much depending on species. So once we have this, clarification, which species are we talking about, the one that is important livelihood or the ones that is important for the household livelihood, the rest of the index focuses on decision making, on household expenditure, income and work share. It looks at the involvement in work and decision-making about a range of livestock activities, animal feeding, health, cleaning, food preparation and breeding, but then also crop cultivation and off-farm employment, because in Tanzania farms are always a mixture of crop and livestock, and therefore to get a full picture of the empowerment, we put together a crop cultivation, animal, livestock, and off-farm employment. And finally, the WELI also looks at access to and control over marketing, credit, agricultural inputs, trainings, and then groups. In this table, you can see the dimensions of empowerment that we focused on, and then the related indicators. So the dimensions are decisions about agricultural production, decisions related to nutrition, access to and control over resources, control and use of income, access to and control of opportunities, and then extent and control of own time. These dimensions are mostly based on the WEI and on other universal standard domain dimensions of empowerment, and we have slightly changed them, as I mentioned before, to really focus or zoom in livestock, and also to make sure they were compatible with the Tanzanian context we were working on. And on the right column, you can look at the indicators more in detail. Next slide, please. So the last section I'm introducing talks about the validity and the limitations of the tool, and then also the way forward. So what is the WELI good at? We found the WELI to be very helpful because it actually provides a score for empowerment. And having a score, a quantitative score for empowerment, helps monitor changes over time. A score for empowerment also allows connecting empowerment to, for example, nutrition, and understand how they are related. Having a score for empowerment allows us to provide evidence on interventions and whether they are successful or not successful, so that we can improve future implementation. Finally, having a score of individual empowerment allows also comparison across location, which then allows us to prioritize interventions. There are also limitations of the tool, though. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the WELI, in its nature of a quantitative index, does not capture processes of empowerment. So there is a lot of evidence that from qualitative studies mostly that show that empowerment is not a linear progression towards a goal. And this means that, for example, a score that decreases in one of the dimensions of empowerment can actually mean empowerment and not disempowerment. Therefore, assigning a score to empowerment in a specific time only does not allow us to really understand what the score means in the bigger process of empowerment. We also know that empowerment has a lot to do with complex changing social and gender dynamics. Empowerment is about changing power dynamics within individuals and society. And understanding this complexity is really important to understand what interventions work and what do not work and why. And again, the WELI does not help in that sense. Finally, and this is a point that has already been raised in the previous presentation, as I mentioned, the WELI is based on universal indicators of empowerment that we slightly adapted to the livestock and Tanzanian context. But there is actually a very important question here. If we think of empowerment as an individual process of change, as a process of self-determination towards an individual goal, then how valid are universal indicators of empowerment? How meaningful can they really be? So the last slide is about the way forward. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we've been battling with some of these problems, and we started a more qualitative, participatory and in-depth exploration or local perception of empowerment and the relevant indicators for the women livestock keepers that were involved in the WELI. And this could be, for example, a first step for the future to then inform the WELI itself. So you could define locally and qualitatively what is relevant, what do local women understand empowerment to mean, and what do they consider relevant domains and indicators to be, and this could then inform the development of the WELI. At the same time, this is quite problematic because we would end up with a lot of WELIs based on individual dimensions. An alternative is actually to then rather conduct an in-depth assessment to identify what are common domains across the respondent women, and this could be used for generalization. And then we could, for example, keep individual specific domains that would then add more depth to the WELI. We could just also decide that we just stick to empowerment as an individual process, and we would just compare scores across these the identified indicators, regardless of how different these pathways or indicators may be. In terms of way forward, what we are also doing, we are undertaking a qualitative validation of associations between empowerment and nutrition to also understand which domains of empowerment exactly affect nutrition of the women themselves and of their children. So thank you so much. That was my last slide, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. We'll now move on from the IMMANA grant on women's empowerment and livestock to the Women Empowerment and Nutrition Index being led by Erin at the University of Texas in Austin. So Erin, on over to you.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you everyone for attending. I think this is a really exciting set of presentations, and I think there's a lot of complementarities. I think it's exciting to see the folks involved in this sort of research. I think we're coming to a set of kind of common understandings, which is great. So the Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index, this is also funded by IMMANA. My collaborators include Sudha Narayanan and Marzia Fontana, and the research I'm going to talk about today, which was in Bangladesh, was co-led by me and Rose Rahman, who works with Nijra Kori. I'll talk a little bit more about Nijra Kori in a bit. It's a landless laborers movement. I also will be talking about, we were also assisted by Nirali Bakla, Ankita Mandal, and Krishna Ranaware, who are all graduate students, as well as members of the Nijra Kori research teams. Next slide, please. Amy, slide. Thank you. So I'm not going to talk too much about the role of gender in mediating ag to nutrition pathways. I think Catherine and Amy and Alessandra and Stephanie have all done a really excellent job at that. What we're starting out with when we're thinking about the Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index is our working definition of what nutritional empowerment means. And for us, nutritional empowerment is the capacity for a woman, and not just her children, to be well-fed and healthy, to have a meaningful say in household nutritional practices, and to receive support in implementing them. Like the folks with working on WELI, our starting point is also Naila Kabir's 1999 conceptualization of empowerment, thinking about resources, agencies, and achievements. And these are sort of guiding principles for us as we develop WENI. Now, our research objective is to develop an index that reflects nutritional empowerment across agrarian contexts in South Asia. And interestingly, unlike Alessandra's approach, we're starting with the participatory research in order to identify some of these less studied domains. We'll ultimately then be collecting quantitative data, but we're doing it kind of in a reverse order. Next slide, please. So our participatory research is happening right now in India. We finished it up a couple of weeks ago in Bangladesh. And our first stage is to identify overlooked factors that might influence nutritional empowerment. There's a great body of literature out there around what factors are associated with empowerment, what things influence nutrition, and there's some really excellent secondary data sources out there like the demographic and health surveys So we'll use those data ultimately with our participatory research findings to generate the index. But right now we're looking at sort of what are people on the ground saying when we talk to them about nutrition, when we talk to them about household decision making, power in their households, sources of tension, and about concern and about sort of factors that might influence their nutritional outcomes. We have 3 sites. We're working in northern Bangladesh, in Gaibandha and Rangpur. The particular villages are sort of somewhere in those 2 red dots up at the top. We're also working in Orissa and Bihar. We think collectively these 3 locations will enable comparisons by livelihood strategies, ethnicity, and religion. Next slide, please. So our participatory research is with Nidra Kori in Bangladesh. For those of you who don't know about Nidra Kori, it means we do it ourselves. It's a landless laborers group, and they have about 180,000 members across 1,100 villages throughout Bangladesh. These landless laborers are primarily focused on understanding what their rights are and then learning the tools to advocate for their rights. So much of their work is focused on demanding access to common land or kosh land, also to demanding access to the right to inherit land, which is enshrined in Bangladesh as a right that Muslim women have, but oftentimes they are not able to access this land for a variety of different reasons, and also to use the right for information to advocate among local politicians for services. So what we've done for the participatory research approach is we have worked with 14 Nidra Kori landless group members who spent 5 days training with us on issues around nutritional empowerment. And this training included discussions on research ethics, on best research practices, on how to use microphones, and on what is in fact the set of research questions that we think are most interesting. And this was a collective decision together using the Nidra Kori members' experiences as well as our experiences as academics. Ultimately, 10 members, 2 of whom were men, were selected to interview people from both their home villages and their surrounding villages for about 7 days. Each day, folks did about 2 interviews. We have about 140 interviews. These interviews are unstructured, and they included both members of Nidra Kori and people who are not members of Nidra Kori. They included folks who are who are in nuclear households, who are in joint families, both mothers-in-laws and daughter-in-laws, women who were widows, and women who were divorced, as well as some men, although obviously a little bit less. Next slide, please. So collectively, we worked together for about 2 days to identify what we thought of as the factors influencing nutrition and the factors that were related to nutrition, including issues around power, sources of decision-making, and tensions in the household. Now, what you can see here is a whole smattering of different things. And ultimately, what we kind of agreed upon was starting interviews with the question, tell me about what you ate last night. And these are open-ended questions, and people would oftentimes, while talking with our participatory researchers, discuss issues, sort of, you see the house under the word research, of who gets fed first. How much does each person in the household get? How is the food divided? This also sometimes led to questions of, well, where does the food come from? Does it come from the farm? And so there you can see the paddy and the small pond. Does it come from common resources such as rivers? Does it come from the market, which are those little houses sort of directly in the bottom middle of the picture? Who's cooking the food? This is a little fire. Where does the water come from for this food? And has the water been tested for arsenic? Interestingly, many people in Gaibandha, for example, know that their water is tainted with arsenic, but they don't necessarily have a lot of options to address that. Furthermore, what are people's sort of sanitary behaviors? Bangladesh in the last 15 to 20 years has really moved away from open defecation. Many people now have latrines. That's that funny little picture under participatory research, under the word participatory. Other issues that emerged were questions around the role of religion in what people cooked or didn't cook. The role of social norms, those are sort of the funny faces directly above the mandir and the mosque and the church. Also questions around education. So many people talked about how they needed more information about what they wanted to be feeding their children, or they felt that education was sometimes an additional pressure that they faced when balancing household budgets. In the top corner, there's questions around antenatal health practices, questions around home delivery versus hospital delivery, pregnancy, sort of access to medical care after pregnancy, and also a lot of concern. Women expressed a lot of concern about what they should be eating and whether or not they were getting enough food while pregnant. Lastly, and I think this is really quite interesting, given Stephanie's kind of earlier description, many women talked about domestic violence and talked about food as a trigger for domestic violence. And I want to be clear here that we're not talking about food as a cause or, sort of cooking as a cause of domestic violence. Rather, it's a trigger. And I think that this is something that's quite interesting about participatory research. These kinds of connections are not necessarily ones that would have come out immediately had I been doing the research myself. So getting to work with community researchers was really valuable for that reason. Next slide, please. So what can participatory research tell us about gender and nutrition? Well, I'm going to give a couple of examples, but I would like to caveat this by saying it's still early. We don't have all of our findings from India yet, and we haven't fully analyzed our data. Ultimately, we will be doing some tabulations, hoping, as Alessandra is, to find certain domains that cross-cut and sort of so we don't end up in a situation of individual empowerment measures for each person. We do have some potential implications thus far for our understanding of empowerment. And first is this: poverty, not surprisingly, amplifies the effect of a lack of empowerment on nutrition. And in the situations, for example, of domestic violence, women are oftentimes undermining their own nutritional status or the nutritional status of their children in order to avoid domestic violence. So women spoke about choosing to eat less so that there was enough for their spouses. Furthermore, we find that empowerment within domains varies. So we're not finding obviously like sort of male domains and female domains, and I'll talk about freedom of movement as an example in a moment. Lastly, we're also finding that empowerment for individual women also across domains varies, and this gets back to Alessandra's point that sometimes a dimension score or domain score might be lower for a particular kind of activity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this person is not empowered. In fact, there's a lot of negotiation that goes on within households. Women pick their battles, and I'll have an example of that. Next slide, please. So what we heard about freedom of movement. Well, hit next, Amy. Thank you. So Shapla, for example, says, I have the right to work inside and outside of the house. Okay, next. Nazma also says that she can go to the market. Her husband is, quote, not the sort of person who scolds or questions me if I spend more. Further, when he goes to the market, quote, he buys too much of one thing or forgets something. And for me, this is quite consonant with how many people feel about their spouses going to the grocery store. I found this pretty amusing. Third, please. Jayantia, in contrast, argues that, she says, we can't go out without permission, no matter what. I go only if my husband gives me permission. Next, please. Asama, meanwhile, reports that she's approached by a religious and social elite from her village about the importance of maintaining purdah. She also says that these elites complained to her husband about this. And so what this is telling us is that the women face different levels of pressure, and focusing on questions that are residing only within the domain of household decisions might miss some of these other forces that influence how women behave and influences women's abilities to make the decisions that are best for them and for their families. I think this also sort of suggests the importance of understanding people's motivations. Next slide, please. So now I want to sort of give you a little bit of a short story about Shamsunahar, and I think she really kind of underscores the complexity that we're seeing across domains. And I think this sort of brings to us the value of considering multiple domains when evaluating or when developing an index. So Shamsunahar owns a shop where she sits all day. She and her husband decided to open this up as her agricultural income was inadequate. While she reports that her husband lets her go wherever she wants, she also reports that her husband does most of the buying from the market. Shamsunahar says, quote, this is the most obvious thing to do. She is not a widow to go to the market all by herself, end quote. She also gives her husband the money that she earns from the shop to buy her saris. He chooses the sari color and the design. She treats her children, which is 1 son and 2 daughters, equally after attending Nidra Kori's Women Committee meetings. She influences her husband on this topic too. Food is now shared equally by all of her children. For example, the fish heads are halved and shared. Shamsu Nahar is currently involved in a land conflict with her husband's brother. As a member of Nidra Kori's Women's Committee, she was aware of her rights and was able to advocate for herself. Her husband sided with her brother and wanted her to stop fighting the case. This led to domestic violence. The local committee of elites, called the Shalish, intervened and ruled against her. She then went to the police. And right now the case is still winding its way through the police and the court system. What I think is so compelling about Shamsu Nahar's story is that it would be very simple for us to look at kind of classic examples of measures of empowerment, such as does she earn money? Is she experiencing domestic violence? And saying, oh, well, on the one hand, it appears that she is empowered because she's earning her own money, but on the other hand, she's experiencing domestic violence, so perhaps she's not. But rather, if we go back to Kabir and we think about this idea of processorial empowerment as opposed to instrumentalist empowerment, I would argue that it's too simplistic to look at a few domains. She is choosing her battles. She is not fighting for the right to wear a sari of a specific color, but she's choosing something that's more important. She's choosing for the right to fight for land, even though it's one of the outcomes of this is domestic violence. And I think that, to me, this really speaks to her sort of taking a step back from the traditions and norms in her community and saying, well, what do I want as a woman who is valued? Next slide, please. So what can participatory research tell us about gender and nutrition? Well, thinking about our next steps, we'll continue to identify these overlooked factors. We'll finish collecting the data in August, and we'll start tabulating the data from these 3 sites to identify potentially common areas or areas that seem particularly salient to our understanding of nutritional empowerment. We'll then generate a WANI by incorporating findings from the research, from secondary reviews of literature, and from secondary data. I do believe that statistics are, in fact, quote, simple windows on complex realities, as Naila Kabir has pointed out, and I would argue that indices are as well. However, I think as Alessandra has really nicely put it, there's still a lot of value to generating these indices for accountability reasons and others. So after we generate the index, we'll then collect quantitative data and women's anthropometric data in order to validate our index, in order to validate WANI. And our goal is to try to generate a nuanced index that potentially incorporates both multiple domains and measures of motivation and autonomy. I'm looking forward to sharing our findings with you. It might be another year or so. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin. And I think that's it for all of our presentations. We're all still here and would be happy to take questions. And I believe Joe and Sunitha will facilitate that process.
Amy, I have a question for your team. Can you guys talk about anemia a little bit more and the role of anemia as an important anthropometric measure for, or as an important health measure for women, or nutritional measure for women?
Sure. And I've even had some conversations with other gender specialists and human rights advocates who argue that anemia might be a really interesting canary in the coal mine for women's status and sort of as a human rights issue. Anemia is a complex condition. Oftentimes we think of it as a problem with iron and insufficient iron intakes, but iron is only one component of the anemia problem. Anemia is low hemoglobin, and so there's not the ability for the body to transport oxygen as it needs to for the brain, to the muscles, and so you will often see fatigue, diminished cognitive capacity, diminished productivity, both physical, economic productivity is lowered. In young children, it can have long-term consequences for cognitive development and schooling outcomes and later performance in the workforce. For women, it's also associated with increased risks of depression and anxiety. And so it's a really fascinating, sad condition that affects a very large proportion of women in the world. The causes are multifactorial. So yes, iron deficiency is one of the primary causes. It's estimated that about 50% of all anemia globally is related to iron deficiency, though that differs by context substantially. So in some contexts, it may be only about 10% of anemia is attributed to iron, and in other contexts, it can be upwards of 50, 60, 70%. But because anemia is a hemoglobin measure, other conditions like helminth infections, intestinal parasites, malaria, chronic diseases, HIVs, cancer, as well as some conditions of cardiovascular disease can contribute to anemia, and other micronutrients also contribute to anemia, including folic acid deficiency, B12 deficiency, and also in some ways vitamin A deficiency can also contribute to the development of anemia because vitamin A is important in the use of iron for development of the heme. So it's a complex condition, and when you think about the causes, it's not just about having adequate access to food, but it's also about having adequate access to clean water, adequate sanitation, and then also adequate health systems. So it is an interesting indicator to look at.
Yeah, thank you for that. Something that was interesting when we were doing our research in Gaibunda is Gaibunda has very low water tables. It has a lot of people have well water that it has arsenic. It also has incredibly high iron content in the water, so much so that you can actually taste it. And so it's interesting because the anemia that people experience in Gaibunda is not related to iron deficiency per se. It's other drivers, and it really does complicate the pathways. And so I think about overlaying this incredibly complicated pathway around anemia on top of incredibly complicated pathways around agriculture and livestock and nutrition, and it's a really fascinating kind of set of intersections.
And I think it's a shortcoming on the field of nutrition. Apologies to all the nutritionists out there, but we tend to approach anemia as an iron problem without thinking about all of the other aspects of anemia. And so when we talk about anemia, we often think it's an iron issue and we just want to throw more iron supplements at it or iron fortification, which is important, but it's not going to take you all the way to reductions of anemia that we want to see to make significant public health impacts in many contexts, especially when issues of infection and malaria are so rampant.
Thank you. That was interesting. And I don't know if Catherine, are you still there?
She's just had to step out quickly. That should be in about 5 minutes, I think. Okay, cool.
So I was also wondering, Alessandra, if you could speak a little bit more about how you guys see your qualitative research kind of playing out in terms of what are you guys looking for and what are you excited about hearing? And then I'd also just like to say to all the participants that you should feel free to type in questions. I think on your right-hand side of your GoToWebinar box there should be questions, a question space that you can send, and we'd be happy to answer them.
So thank you for the question. Yes, we are undertaking, as I said, qualitative research now, it is extremely fascinating. We basically have been asking the women respondents to tell us what they think an empowered person is, and the findings are very interesting, especially because I think these universal indicators that we are using are very much focused on an individual kind of approach to empowerment. Our approach is very individualistic in that sense, while many of the respondents see themselves as part of the household and as part of the community. So I think we need to do more research in that sense. I think we are too much coming to do fieldwork on empowerment with a specific idea of what empowerment is, and it is about independence, and it is about showing that you are autonomous. But these are not always necessarily the values that that doing work that other people have about empowerment. And what I find particularly exciting is that I think working on empowerment really helps also challenge our own preconceived ideas about what it means to be an empowered person. So us as researchers as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's very challenging, but it's really exciting. And I think this something that kind of kept coming back as we've started to analyze our data is exactly as your point, which is many women are more able to be to stand up for decisions that they believe in when they have support networks available to them. So, for example, we heard over and over again the importance of being able to return to one's father's house in times of tension, or the importance of being a Nidra-Kori member and having women from your women's group approach your husband about issues that you were struggling with, or being able to bring your husband to a women's group meeting to talk about issues. And I think that these sorts of of community and kind of household level factors really drive women's abilities to make choices that they want to be making. And so I think that was something that was really interesting for me to get to hear, because I think it isn't something, I think you're right, there is very much this individualistic approach that at least I was bringing with me to the field.
Thanks, Erin. It's Joe here, and sorry we had a couple of mic issues, but we've got quite a few questions coming in now. And so I'll just try and direct them out one by one. First question about the Welly index. How long does the Welly take to administer? Is it administered to both men and women in the household like Way is? And that's from Amanda Wendt.
So yes, thank you very much for the question. At the moment, the Welly takes a little while. I would say between 2 and 3 hours per household, which is actually individual. That depends also on the species that they choose at the beginning of the questionnaire. As I said before, at the very inception of the survey, we asked the women to talk about, to tell us what are the species that are most important for their own livelihoods and which are the ones that are most important for their household. So if they mention one only, because they coincide, then the survey will be much shorter. If they mention 2, then the survey becomes longer, up to 3 hours. We are currently revising the survey and removing the non-essential parts, so it should become shorter. In terms of working with involving both women and men respondents, I think it would be ideal. At the same time, in our case, we were working, as I said, on establishing the connection between the empowerment of women specifically and the nutrition of themselves and their children. So that was our focus, and also for reasons of efficiency, we only focused on women livestock keepers. But indeed, it would be interesting to work with men and women.
I have a clarifying question. This is Sunita. I have a clarifying question on the time taken to administer Welly. This is Sunita Karyala here. Is it 3 hours for the entire survey or just the administration of that module? Because 3 hours seems a bit over the top, and whereas WEA takes maybe half an hour or something, or 20 minutes. So I was just wondering if you could clarify that for Elizabeth, who asked this question.
Yes, I mean, I think on average it took 2 hours per individual. At the same time, it is not much longer than the way. It just expands some parts on livestock. So I'm surprised the way it takes only half an hour. So, and it also always depends. We worked with a software with ODK. So I don't know if that affected the timing of utilization. I would have thought that it would have made things a bit faster. But yes, I think at least 2 hours per individual it took us in Tanzania.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got a question, Erin, for you here. This is from Unfanat, who's saying, how is food used as a trigger of domestic violence? Do you have an example of that?
Thanks for the question, and yeah, my apologies. I'm working on trying not to take too much time talking about these issues. What we're hearing is women described multiple times concerns that husbands, particularly their husbands, although sometimes their father-in-laws, would expect to have the choicest pieces of fish or the largest pieces. If women had set or fixed budgets and were not able to buy what men were expecting to eat, they could often experience domestic violence when men got home and sort of arrived home to eating food that they didn't like. We had a male respondent say that he thought, slapping someone or slapping his wife when she cooked food he didn't like was a reasonable thing to do. We also had a male respondent say, if my wife is trying to tell me how to sell crops, and she keeps pushing me, then yeah, I'll hit her. And so there's multiple different ways that food is tied into domestic violence, and I think that some of this is people looking for reasons if they're feeling quite frustrated, for example, and are looking to pick a fight. Sometimes eating is the very first thing that men are doing when they're getting back into a house, and so it's an easy trigger. But I would caution that this is not a cause, right? There's no reason why someone cooking a bad dinner should result in domestic violence, but it is a trigger. Does that distinction make sense, the trigger versus cause piece?
I think so, and I'm just looking for the info-nat. If you'd like to respond to that, then you're welcome to on the questions. But while we're waiting for that, there's a more general question coming here from Cecil, who's a master's student in global health, and she wants to ask if anyone has experience in how to gain useful qualitative information for women-headed households on decision-making / access to markets and or of freedom of speech, and if so, what gender barriers should we consider when the husband is not around, for instance, working abroad? Or I don't know if anyone's able to address.
I'd be happy to speak to that based on our sort of our initial analysis of our data. There are a lot of women who either are widowed or have husbands abroad, or have been divorced. And in rural Bangladesh, many of these women end up either back in their father's houses or living with a brother. And so then there is at least in these particular situations, fathers exert a fair amount of, or can exert a fair amount of influence on sort of the and furthermore, as can brothers. And so we had at least a handful of women say that they experienced domestic violence at the hands of their brothers, in part due to resources and other sorts of tensions. So I think that attending, whether or not people are living in joint households matters. Certainly also women who have sort of older children sometimes also involve their children in these decisions. So asking kind of the composition of the household can really kind of start allowing you to better understand what's happening in terms of who's participating in these sorts of decisions.
I would also like to add something. This is Alessandra. I've done quite a lot of qualitative work on empowerment before getting involved in the WELI, and I found the decision-making element extremely interesting. What was particularly interesting for me was that taking decisions at household level seems to be in most culture men's domain. And for that reason, every time you interview people in a group, or there are just your respondents and maybe some of the men of the household or some neighbors, both the men and the women will just talk reflecting the consensus norms. They will just tell you, yes, I may consult with my wife, but anyway, I am the one, as the man of the household, who takes decisions. And I had a specific interesting case of an old lady in Syria where I was working. She kept saying that her son was the one taking decisions in the farm because he was the man of the household, although she admitted that she had most of the knowledge and was doing most of the work. And then while we were having this somehow lengthy discussion, her son kept going in and out of the household because he was selling some hay. And he was coming in the house and asking her, so how much, how many kilos should I sell? And she was like, telling him the quantity. And then he would go out and then come in again. He's suggesting this price. And she would say, no way, don't go below this price. And, the discussion going on, it was very interesting that she kept telling us that he was the one taking decisions, and we observed in practice that in fact she was taking the decisions. So this is to say, I think it's very interesting to also observe how things are played out in real life, because sometimes people, they conform to the norm when they speak publicly, but then the daily realities that they live might be quite different.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Thanks, Alessandra. Amy, I have a question for you, and maybe Catherine as well. Less of a question, more, I was wondering whether you could just talk a little bit more about the association between program participation and domains in women's empowerment. I think you said there was like a strong association between these two. Or is that to say that there's an improvement in women's empowerment with participation?
Well, that's actually what we're hoping to see. There's quite a bit of observational research looking at women's empowerment and child nutrition and women's health seeking and a number of these health practices and health outcomes. But the actual impact of specific gender interventions on women's empowerment, the evidence base from those kinds of programs is not as prominent, if you will. The research is simply not there. There is some programmatic work from the gray literature that supports that potentially programs with participatory approaches can improve women's empowerment, but the evaluation of the improvements in women's empowerment is a little bit questionable. And so I think ours might be one of the first, not the first, but I think it's one of the early studies that's going to be able to look at the impacts of agricultural strategies on potentially shifting women's empowerment. The ones that have been done, again, you've had repeat cross-sectional surveys, so you don't see change at an individual level, which would be interesting. Our work over the next 3 years will allow us to look at the individual change with program participation across these 3 sites.
Okay, and do you, beyond the scope of this particular program, do you think there will be potential to continue following these individuals to see if there's any change after the program?
Well, that of course depends on funding, because getting follow-on funding can be quite difficult. We've actually attempted to do that for another project in Kenya working with sweet potato, and we have yet to be able to obtain funding to look at sustained impacts or to look at issues around empowerment in those households. I think as well, because those programs are not run by Emory, it's not necessarily up to us to get those sustained funds. It will be the implementers themselves. So ILRI, for example, in Tanzania and Kenya, and then in Ethiopia, it will be our project, the community-based project we're working on with Stand for Vulnerable organization. And in that project, we have a very interesting approach to this because it is a livestock-focused project, but it's looking at strategies that decrease women's workload and allow them to participate in income generation through livestock value chains by producing feed inputs and then raising small micro livestock, so poultry, and then eventually graduating up into larger ruminants. And that project has a very specific participatory curriculum for promoting women's self-efficacy, shifting social norms through community-based work, and also weekly sessions, participatory weekly sessions on health-seeking, WASH, and maternal and child nutrition. So very much the education component is woven in throughout that, in addition to the development components that look at income generation through innovations in women's ability to produce livestock feed.
Right, okay. Interesting, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left and there's a couple more questions, so I'll fire through them quickly. Matilda has asked, I think it was Stephanie's presentation, she said, that listed currently married only women as the selection criteria for the DHS analysis. So Matilda's wondering why cohabiting couples were not included in this.
Yeah, you're. I'm sorry, that was a clarification issue. Yes, it was cohabiting as well. I apologize. That was currently married and/or cohabiting, so living with her main partner at the time. Thank you. Yep.
Okay, great. So that clarifies that. And then there's one more question for Erin, and this is about WENI. And is it just to say from Elizabeth, is it being tested only in South Asia at the moment, Erin?
So thanks, Elizabeth, for the question. Like Amy, I'm going to say right now for the 3-year duration of the project, this is South Asia focused, but we ultimately do hope to roll it out in other countries contingent upon funding. I think we wanted to start explicitly comparing Bangladesh and South Asia, in part because there's been such different declines in undernutrition or much more rapid declines in undernutrition in Bangladesh than in India, especially around stunting. But ultimately, I think our goal is to field it elsewhere as well. We needed to start small because, as you may know, collecting data is an expensive prospect. But yeah, thank you for the question. Our hope is larger and bigger one day.
Ours as well, yes.
Well, on that note, I'd like to I think we probably run out of time now, but I'd say thanks so much to our presenters and for all the input and for all the people who have joined and all the great questions. The slides and the audio from this webinar will be up on the IMMANA website later today, and you'll also receive an email so you can give us any feedback about how you experienced the webinar. So thanks again to everyone for coming and for being involved. If you're not a member of the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy that sits within IMMANA, then please do join up because there'll be lots more of these events, and you can follow the events from the first Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy week, which is being held in June this year in Ethiopia, and there'll be lots of resources online. So do sign up if you can, and if there's any queries in the meantime, feel free to contact us. There's lots of information on the website. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.